you go. Perfect.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah. So again, thank you very much, Deborah, for the introduction. This is I've actually lived in Central Illinois or North Central Florida for a long time now. But when my kids were young, I didn't do a lot of local bird watching. But now that we're empty nesters, I've really turned to local bird watching with a vengeance. Now, as Deborah mentioned, I have a kind of an odd mix in all this. I am a fanatical bird watcher, a lister. I like to compete for really large, big days and big years and so on. But I'm also a scientist, and I owe both of these traits. Let's see, to my father, who was introduced me to bird watching when I was only 12, and taught me an incredible amount. He had many hobbies, but he was a very talented bird watcher, so I was able to learn the birds would have taken me years to learn on my own very quickly. He actually knew the songs back then, and he was just one of the very few people who could identify birds by song, at least in Western Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh area where I grew up. But he's also one of the world's most competitive people. He just loved to compete, and I love going bird watching with him and seeing more birds than he did. And this kind of uneasy thing is one of the reasons why I always mix a lot of serious bird watching with my science. So sometimes my colleagues don't mind it. Sometimes I think they kind of wonder exactly what I'm doing with all this. Now, given the kind of bird watcher I am, I was a fanatical local bird watcher in the Pittsburgh area. But as I started to do a little bit more traveling, I became pretty much obsessed with identifying the world's richest bird communities and going to work in them. You have to understand, back in the 60s and 70s, there were no field guides, or what passed for field guides were worse than useless. We knew there were a whole lot of birds in South America and also in other tropical countries, but especially South America. When you look at the actual species diversity contour map, you look at these intense red colors, the richest bird communities in the entire world are located at the base of the Andes, in the western edge of the Amazon basin, either in Ecuador or in southeastern Peru. And when I was choosing graduate schools, I chose a professor named John Terborgh, who is actually living in Cedar Key right now, where he's retired, because he had a field station in this extreme biodiversity hotspot down here. This is called the Manu National Park. I'll talk quite a bit more about that. And so I was drawn to this area because we knew nothing about these birds. You know, here are these incredibly rich bird communities. I'll show you lots of slides of the birds. They're very charismatic birds. There are a lot of them, but we just, at the time we did it, we didn't know their songs, their natural history. We were still describing new species. The whole thing was a whole brave new world. And there's something else that was true that back then is still true to some extent now, is that this entire area is still mostly forested. When I took this photo in the early 1980s, this was a continuously forested for more than 1,400 miles. There were no breaks in the forest outside of rivers. And so this is an incomparably large wilderness. There are still uncontacted tribes in this area. Now, to say they're uncontacted doesn't mean they don't know we're here. They just choose not to make contact with us. They don't want any part of us, but they're wandering around and they're living their traditional lifestyle. So this wilderness still exists, and this was irresistibly attractive to me. This is John Terborgh himself. To get down into the Amazon basin back in this time, it was really an adventure. You know, I know that sounds like a cliche, it's an adventure, but it often took, between the time we flew into Lima, got all our permits from the government, went to Cusco up in the highlands to buy our supplies, and then took a 3-day truck trip and a 2 to 3 day boat trip, depending on the kind of boat you had. This was generally about a 2-week operation just to get to a decent site in Amazonia. And what we really were seeking was a site where there were no, the only humans who lived in the area were the people who have been living there for a very long time. We wanted to study pristine nature, if there is such a thing. And this was a goal. We still had the opportunity in the Amazon basin to study what it was like before human conditions had changed. And I'm sad to say a lot of work in the Amazon basin now is suggesting that even far from humans, the bird communities are changing mostly for the worse. So anyway, John Terborgh had this field station, and he is truly one of the great ecologists and probably the greatest tropical ecologist of the modern era. I went to grad school to work with him, and this trip into Coachacashu completely changed my life. He was also a great person to learn from. He has probably described 9 or 10 new species of birds. His students have described another 8 or 10 species of birds. And he did pioneering studies in so many different areas. It's almost amazing. And on top of it all, he's still thriving. He's still publishing 20 papers a year from his house at Cedar Key. Now, this is a road called the Manu Road. When we leave the highlands of Peru, we drive down into the eastern slope of the Andes. And this, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little road here that kind of goes through here. It's a very, very tricky road, very narrow road. But this road goes from about 12,000 feet in the Andes down to the Amazon basin, which is about 1,000 feet here. And this is the world's most diverse bird watching road. There are more than 1,000 species of birds on this road. And nowadays there are many lodges. It has a huge ecotourist industry, and I strongly recommend you go there. But at the time, this area was more or less unknown. This was simply the area you had to drive through to get to the lowlands. We knew there were amazing birds on this road, but there was, other than just stopping along the roadside when the trucks would break down or get stuck, that was about it. So this road itself was a one-way road. You went downhill on Monday, came back up on Tuesday. On Sunday, the road was both ways, but it was so dangerous that virtually no one used it except in emergencies. The various field crews would load into these trucks and sit in these trucks on top of our gear for several hours of what can only be described as misery. We're all smiling, but you can tell they're all forced smiles. And then, but every once in a while, we would get a flash of what some of the birds we were seeing. This is a lek of the cock of the rock. And every once in a while, you would see one of these birds flying around, or if you drove past one of these leks early in the morning, you'd see this fairly large bird. It's about the size of a pigeon, maybe a little bigger than a pigeon, that would be making these fantastic sounds. And you knew there was great stuff, but the goal was the Amazon basin. We often, the landslides would sweep the road away periodically. We'd often have to spend several days helping them rebuild the road. There were little tunnels in here. The road itself, the Manu Road, is an engineering marvel. And some of these tunnels are exactly as big as a truck. And finally, we would get down into the lowlands, where we would, once again, back in the old days when this road's still pretty primitive. We would get stuck, and we eventually work it. And then finally, in the foothills of the Andes, we would hit this river, the Alto Madre de Dios River, the Upper Mother of God River, which is in itself one of the great biological sites. You can't quite see this, but there are these little isolated foothills of the Andes that are separated from the main chain. And John Terborgh and John Fitzpatrick, who was the director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, at least he was until quite recently, they went up these little ridges and discovered 5 new species of birds, that could only live in these isolated ridges. But eventually you would load, at the end of the truck trip, you'd load your stuff into a boat, into these boats, often with these little inboard, outboard motors, and then take the boat trips up the Amazon, up down the Alto Madre and then up the Manu River. These boats are very slow, but very noisy. And then the trip itself up the Manu River, you just go up and down this river as it meanders back and forth. This is what's called a whitewater river, meaning it's very productive. At high waters, it's quite white. There are these little oxbow lakes, which are also called coaches, which are, again, bird watching paradise. But just to get from here to here may only be 10 miles, but it might be a 25 or 30 mile boat trip. But the river trip itself is simply one of the most astonishing things you'll ever do, because as you get deeper and deeper into the Amazon in search of these pristine habitats, you start seeing amazing birds. The blue and yellow macaw. You start seeing macaws flying overhead routinely. And again, this is just the most amazing sight if you've never seen one before. The last population of this Orinoco goose, which is sort of a shelduck-like thing, for those of you who know the ruddy shelducks that are starting to take off here in Central Florida. This is in that same general group of waterfowl. You see them nesting on the beaches. There's only about 100 of them left in Peru. Then you get the Muscovy duck, which is actually a pretty noble, pretty amazing bird. We in Florida, we think of it as a real plague, this kind of ugly, strange thing that's out there. But in its proper habitat, this is a really impressive, gigantic duck in which the males are several times larger than the females. And then you occasionally see things like sunbitters, which are one of the iconic birds of the lowland tropics in the Central and South America because of this amazing wing pattern. And then screamers, these giant, very ancient lineage of sort of something like kind of like a large goose, but with a very different. These horned screamers make sounds you can hear from a mile away. And you start seeing birds that are really the kinds of birds that listers just go crazy over. And then you also get into the place where there are top predators. Probably the Manu River boat trip is probably the place where the most people have seen jaguars. After a cold front comes through, these southern cold fronts called friajes move through the area, cool it off for a few days, which is lovely, and it rains. And then all these animals that are not at all used to cold, rainy weather come out on the beach to dry off. And they're very tame, you know, they're fearless. And you can get 50 feet from a jaguar that's sunning, and all it will do is look at you and speculate about what will happen if you come just a little bit closer. And so this is, again, these are the sorts of things you see. Occasionally you even see harpy eagles. You're starting to get into this area where top predators are important. And we now know something we didn't know a long time ago, which is that these top predators actually run the world. They're very, very important in understanding how ecosystems function. And eventually you get to the place where the giant otter still lives in abundance. The giant otter was one of the reasons why the Manu National Park was formed. And because back then there were only a few known populations of them, they're now spreading and doing very well. But this is a 6 or 7 foot long otter. If you go swimming in one of these lakes, every once in a while they'll come up and play with you, which is quite possibly the scariest thing that will ever happen to you. They eat piranhas and they eat all kinds of things. And then you start seeing the big game birds, what we call game birds, like the piping guan, the blue-throated piping guan, which is a very kind of bird that is hunted to extinction in most areas that have been settled for a long time. And then you get to the black caiman, which is the other organism that the Manu Park focused on originally, which is, this was one of the last populations that still had reproductive black caimans. These things get to about 17 or 18 feet long, and and most likely they actually killed one of the scientists about 10 years ago who went swimming and never came back in a lake where it turns out there was a 17 or 18 foot black caiman that had just recently moved in. So these things are out there. They're a lot fiercer than alligators, but they're not as fierce as a crocodile. We used to go swimming with them back when we thought they were pretty harmless. We were very, very wrong about that. And then you start again, there are getting more of these iconic Amazonian birds, the hoatzin, the bird in which the fledglings have claws on their wrists so they can crawl around. It's one of the only leaf-eating birds. They fly rather poorly, but they're very noisy, very common on oxbow lakes in this area. These are again really desirable birds to see. And then trumpeters have a fantastic bouncing ball kind of call. They're one of the very few ground, but they're again about the size of a chicken. They're a ground living fruit-eating bird, which is an amazing niche because fruit in the tropical forest, when fruit hits the ground, it rots a very short time later. So for them to get fresh fruit, they follow troops of monkeys, which then knock the fruit on the ground, they run and eat it. It's an interesting bird too, because some of the native tribes catch them when they're young and raise them as pets because they also eat ticks. This Manu Park area. I should mention the Manu National Park, where I'll talk a little bit more about later, but it's a park of about 3 or 4 million acres that is now connected to many other parks. It was one of the very first of the huge national parks that now are spread out throughout the Amazon basin. These are parks that are designed to be large enough to shelter entire ecosystems and protect entire floodplains of the rivers, such as the Manu River. These macaws here, these are the red and green macaws, are eating clay to help them digest, to neutralize the tannins they take in from their diet of seeds. And these mineral lakes you've all seen images of these. The first one that was ever found was in the Manu Road area. As I mentioned earlier, there are also tribes that are still living at various levels of their more traditional lifestyles. These are Machigenga Indians, who or the tribe that live along the river. They have a fair amount of contact with Westerners and with the rest of the Peruvian society, but they still are living a mostly traditional lifestyle in these dugout canoes. Then there are tribes that are still really quite warlike in a lot of ways. The Nawa Indians or Yaminawa Indians. These particular people here apparently went in and stole a bunch of gear from the petroleum explorers, and they came through. And for whatever reason, the scientists at the biological station, they didn't bother us. They periodically they go up and grab the shirts or grab our laundry off the line, not realizing it was our. But these people would come through our field station now and then and just treat us with just like regular folks, just kind of chatting with us and gathering around us. Then there are these three women here from the Mashco Piro tribe. This is a tribe that is still living, deliberately avoiding contact with us. These three women left their tribe for reasons that are still a little bit unclear, and they're now living in the area around the Madre National Park. But again, this tribe is still very defensive. If you leave them alone, they leave you alone. But if you make inroads into the area, they shoot arrows at you. So anyway, as you move up and down the river, eventually we would get to this place right here, this beach right here. And this is Cochicashu, which is an oxbow lake. You can see it used to be part of the Manu River. Our biological station is located right here in the floodplain of the Manu River, which just meanders back and forth across this floodplain. These ridged areas in here, what do we call terra firme forest, which is forest that's more upland. It's a little drier, a little hillier. But this is what I consider, this is the closest thing I know of in the world to paradise. It has incredibly rich animal communities. It has the native tribes that live in the area. They leave us alone. They don't bother us in the slightest, even though we know perfectly well that they know they're there. This is where many scientists have worked for a long time. And most of what I'm going to be talking about, this big day that I did, was based upon a study of birds we were doing in this section of the forest. It's relatively old growth floodplain forest. And the big day we talked about, we did the entire big day in this area right here, almost exactly 1 square mile. And this big day we did, the goal of this was just to have fun, to try to break a world record, because this is the world's richest bird community. So why shouldn't we do a big day? We were one of the very few people who actually knew the songs of the birds in this area. This is the Cochicashu Biological Station back in the late 70s. Back when there was no electricity, there was no internet, there was no contact with the outside world at all. We would disappear for 2 or 3 months at a time, occasionally hear news of the outside world. But again, living in what was pretty much just a glorious situation. We'd swim out in the lake here. The caimans used to be pretty small, dry our laundry there. We'd have dugout canoes. I did most of my research from a canoe. And we would live in these conditions here, where with a variety of students, Peruvian students, U.S. students. This is me back in my youth. One of the very, very few photos I haven't destroyed from my youth. You notice I have a nice tan compared with some of these poor biologists who work inside the forest, who practically never see the sun. I got to work out on a nice sunlit lake. We had, there are many Peruvian students have trained there, and the station has been run by Peruvians now for the last 25 years. Some very famous people I mentioned. This is John Terborgh, who I've talked about a little bit. In the back here is Robin Foster, who is the greatest living tropical botanist. This is Pat Wright, who some of you may have heard of because she has done more probably to promote conservation in Madagascar than anywhere else. She did her doctorate at studying night monkeys in this area, which is quite an adventurous thing to do. And this is her daughter Amanda, who is probably the toughest kid I've ever known. She thrived in this jungle. And this is a very early, much suppressed photo of John Fitzpatrick, who many of you may know because of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Here he was in his young days. He also did his PhD dissertation on flycatchers at the Cochicashu Biological Station. Now, during the dry season, it's quite nice, but for about 5 months a year, it rains. It rains a lot. This is a rainy season, dry season kind of place. And this is in the floodplain. So when it rains a lot, the water levels go up and it's much, much less pleasant. I managed to avoid most of the dry seasons. This was a particularly major flood during the El Nino year that almost washed away the whole field station. And again, from the early dry season, this is Charlie Munn, a friend of mine who was also in grad school at Princeton. And by the end of the field season, he looked quite a bit different. And this was really, this is just sort of the way it was. He just got grungy. We were still clean, we still bathed and all that, but it was really kind of fun. But instead of, mostly when I was there, I studied this bird here, the Yellow-rumped Cacique, which is an American blackbird that is a colonial bird. That is actually a perfectly wonderful bird to be studying. They nest in colonies. Anyone who's been there knows this. They have these pouch-like nests with the entrance and the side. The males sing in the outside, the females build the nest and do all the work of nesting. And the males fight among themselves. Fascinating bird. They become very, very common. They nest colonially in these tiny little islands, these little isolated trees where they're protected from monkeys, which would otherwise wipe them all out. The Successional Biological Station is located right here, by the way. You can sort of see it right here. And I simply paddled a boat around this lovely tropical lake, watching these birds. I started out in a dugout canoe. Here I am reenacting the exhausting work I did. But my life was much easier. We had this full boat kayak thing where I was more or less like a floating recliner. And I just got to, sometimes had to lift my binoculars and all that. But I really had a very easy, fun thesis studying these birds. Sometimes I have to stand up and take a bird out of a mist net. You can't see that, but there's a mist net over the water here. Now again, John Terborgh, it was John taught me an awful lot about birds. Okay, we had no field guides. John had learned all these birds painstakingly on his own, going to museums and studying bird skins and working out songs on his own. But it was also my good fortune to, when we realized we wanted to do the first ever census of a tropical bird community, we realized that, well, we knew our birds very, very well. I mean, again, John Fitzpatrick taught me quite a bit too, but we knew there were birds out there who knew more than we did, who were better than we were. And this was absolutely the case in a guy named Ted Parker, who tragically died in the early 90s in an airplane crash while exploring a section of Ecuador with a pilot who unfortunately didn't understand the terrain very well. But Ted, in his day, he was I think, almost universally regarded as the greatest living ornithologist. He was strongly associated with the LSU Museum of Natural Sciences, for which I guess we can forgive him. And Ted, when John Terborgh and I decided to do this census on a 250-acre, 100-hectare plot, we invited Ted to collaborate with us in the expectation that he would sort of help us find all of the birds. Because again, no one else knew as much as he did. He probably described the songs of more than 200 or 300 species of birds in Peru alone during his heyday. Here he is working with Roger Tory Peterson himself. Everyone thought he was the heir apparent to Roger Tory Peterson. He was working on the field guide to the birds of Peru when he died, a field guide that wasn't finished until 15 or 20 years later by some of his colleagues. And here he is carrying this gigantic Nagra tape recorder. This is a 25 pound reel-to-reel tape recorder that he would take into the jungle, into the Andes with him, with a Sennheiser microphone and generate the finest recordings ever made. To this day, with all the technology we have, none of the recordings are the equal of what Ted got with this only semi-portable Nagra system. So, but Ted and I were veteran birders who knew what we had, the potential we had here. Oh, and here's John Terborgh running mist nets along the river. For bird watchers, tropical rivers are where you find vagrants. Birds that are wandering through the Amazon that don't really belong in the Amazon move up and down these rivers. And we put out mist nets, which you can sort of barely see. You catch these things. When you put mist nets along the river, you never know what you're going to catch. It's really a lot of fun. John Terborgh didn't come on the big day. I think he had something else to do. I forget why, but he certainly should have been along. But we knew we had some potential because we had this study plot again, about 250 acres, that we had already been mapping the territories of all of these many hundreds of species of birds that lived here. There were some points where there were as many as 170 species whose territories overlapped a single point, or up to 170. And this is something that, again, just no one knew that. No one knew whether you could fit all these hundreds of bird species in these Amazonian forests just by having lots of different habitats, or did they all coexist? Well, it turns out they coexisted. All of these things here, this hairy crested antbird, bird that follows army ant swarms, the strong-billed wood creeper. There are many, many wood creepers. This is one of the easy ones to identify. Forest falcons, very common birds, have 100-acre territories, or less than 100-acre territories. In the understory, they eat a lot of insects, they eat forest birds. Various kinds of Araceres, which are obviously toucan relatives, and ground nesting tinamous, the oldest lineage of birds in the world right now. And you get these giant game animals such as the curassow, razor-billed curassow, which is as big as a turkey and just about as common as a turkey. And one of the things we did when we mapped all their territories in that area I showed you was we discovered something. I'm not going to linger on this too much. This is kind of a boring slide, in which we rank order of decreasing abundance. These are the population densities, territories or home ranges per 100 hectares, 250 acres, about 40% of a square mile. And you see the vast majority of these birds are rare. They have population densities of less than 5 pairs per 250 acres. So what this means is there's a tremendous variety of birds, but they're mostly really rare. And what this means is that if you can move around fast enough, especially in the morning when they're singing, this gives a tremendous potential for big days because they're all right there. You just have to find them. And when you get up to the real tail of this distribution, you got 1 pair per 250 acres or even less. Those birds, those are pretty chancy. Now, I should point out that one of the reasons why these birds are rare is because this is also paradise for primates. There are 13 species of primates there, including the famous brown capuchin monkey with the white-fronted capuchin in the background. They are major nest predators. They eat birds from cavity nests. I've seen them pulling toucans out of holes. There are huge herds of white-lipped peccaries, gigantic. You get 300 white-lipped peccaries move through the forest. They literally scrape everything off the ground. There are many, many snakes that eat bird nests. Toucans are major nest predators. Almost any bird, such as this toucan here, tries to nest on the ground is going to be eaten by peccaries, except in those periods when the herds all die off because of diseases. Snakes it's very hard to be a tropical bird. It's really hard to reproduce. It's one of the main things we've been studying in my lab over the years is just a nest that is built has about at most a 10 or 15% chance of fledging young and escaping predation. But we also knew that these river edge habitats had very different birds. And these river edge habitats are, again, I've already talked a little bit about all the great birds we saw on the boat trip as we came up, but there are also lots of these rare birds you can see. So if you want to take advantage of the full diversity here and do a big day, and again, Ted and I wanted to break the world record. We knew it was possible, and it was just a matter of doing it. And so what we did was we had all these territory maps. We would make sure we would get these river edge ones in addition to the forest ones for this very typical understory antbird, the white-browed antbird. And again, the entire day we did was just in this little area right here, these 2 oxbow lakes here that have some marshy wetland habitats, and then we bird along the edge of the river here. We never went up into the terra firma forest. If we had had a trail system up there, which we didn't, we probably could have added 50 species to the record that we established. And we just, and so we started out at 3 a.m., which is a very leisurely pace by big day standards, because the night birds in this part of the world are pretty easy. There's some really spectacular night birds. A great botu, which sounds like it's vomiting all night long. There are forest falcons. They call at night. The crested owl calls constantly at night. The nightjars, such as the ocellated poorwill. And this bird here, which had an unknown song, we actually, on the early morning, we heard this bird's song and recorded it for the first time. This is called the silky-tailed nightjar. These birds are relatively easy to get, and you can get 20 species of nocturnal birds very easily. And then when the very first light, you get one of the great thrills of being in the tropics, which is you get a dawn chorus. But when it's too dark to forage, when the air is nice and still and sound travels well, and when the bird is too dark to do anything else, a lot of birds have, sing. And this is a time when some birds that live at very low population densities, such as this ground walking antbird called a striated antthrush, and this tree living woodcreeper called a long-billed woodcreeper appropriately, and many tinamous, this ancient lineage that has apparently been around since fairly early in the Cretaceous. The forest falcons, woodcreeper, the motmots, this extremely common family of tropical birds. These things are all singing, they're all making amazing noises, but they may only sing once or twice a morning. That's the problem. Most of these birds are effectively invisible. You'd never see them. You have to hear them. That's just the reality of it. And so early in the morning, we basically just revved up our walking and just walked as fast as we could through all these trails to maximize our chances of being there when the striated antthrush actually sang. So that was the early part of the day. And then we would just keep walking through the forest. And then before it got too hot along the edge of the river, we would get out into this early successional river vegetation, which is a really, really rich area. You've got birds such as the red-billed woodcreeper here that live in the cane vegetation on the edges of the rivers. It also lives in bamboo. You have birds such as this yellow-browed flycatcher, which is actually what we call an austral migrant. They breed down in Argentina and Chile, and they winter in the Amazon basin. And we chose early September because these austral migrants hadn't yet left, but some northern migrants, such as the good old eastern kingbird and shorebirds, were starting to appear down here. There are also some birds that just live out in the early successional super hot vegetation, such as this southern beardless tyrannulate, which is a close relative of the northern beardless tyrannulate we get in South Texas. One of the real any big day has got lots of variability, and you need good water conditions for shorebird. One of the things one of the best things about this particular section of the Amazon basin is there aren't a lot of shorebirds there, but they're really cool shorebirds. In addition to the buff-breasted sandpiper here and the the Baird sandpiper, there are also stilt sandpipers and upland sandpipers, Wilson's phalaropes, and just a large number of the shorter white-rumped sandpipers, birds that are actually fairly tricky to get, almost even in North America. You also get weird phenomena such as eastern kingbirds passively flying together in flocks of 200 or 300, descending on fruiting trees, ignoring insects almost entirely. So choosing a time in September maximized our chance of getting all of these migrants. Now, you also have to be out in the open to see and hear parrot flocks. There are about 20 species of parrots in this particular area, some of which are quite colorful, like the orange-cheeked parakeet or the painted parakeet, and one of which was a bird, the what's his name, the Nanopsidic, I forget the English name of it. It was a bird that Charlie Munn discovered this species just a few months before we did the count. This was a bird that was not known to science before we at least got photographs of it. Those years before they collected. So you had to be out in the open to see the parrots fly over. And then you have to get out on the lake again before it gets too hot. We would paddle the dugout canoe around the lake. We did this entire day on foot and by dugout canoe. And the lake margin, the birds along the margin of these oxbow lakes are really in a class by themselves. The agami heron, which has got to be the world's most beautiful, elegant heron, very long billed thing. We sometimes actually caught those and missed that. The sun bittern I've already talked about. The greater ani, a bird that really, really smells bad, it has these bright colors and nests communally. Tiger herons, which the young ones have these nice tiger strokes. The boat-billed heron, these very abundant rowlets or rails called rufous-sided crakes. These things are absolutely really, really abundant, but you need to get out there to see these things. Lake margin birding is just fun. We're sitting in a canoe paddling, and these birds are mostly quite easy to see down there. And also in the mid-morning, you get the early morning raptor flight where you can have a chance to get birds such as a good old short-tailed hawk, which we've got here in Florida, the ornate hawk eagle, which sometimes soars and calls, the black collared hawk, the slate colored hawk. They're just a whole bunch of nice raptors that that you can see, but which ones you see in any given day is just a matter of luck. And we for everyone we saw, we missed others. Then in the midday, the middle part of the day, we went out and tried to find these mixed species flocks of birds. A very large percentage, very large number of the birds in Amazonia feed together in beautifully organized mixed species flocks. In the understory, they're led by this bluish slate antshrike, which provides very loud alarm calls when predators approach. And in exchange for these predator warnings, they catch a lot of the prey, sometimes even steal prey from birds such as this white-throated ant wren, or these foliage gleaners here, the rufous-tailed foliage gleaner, which poke in dead leaves and do very risky foraging behaviors that are only made possible because this bird is watching their back. This bird is actually known to use false alarm calls. If this particular ant wren catches a really big, juicy katydid, this thing will sometimes give a false alarm call, which will cause this bird to drop the katydid, dive for cover, and then the ant shrike will fly down and grab it. The white-shouldered shrike tanager leads the canopy flocks, which just have these magnificently beautiful birds, such as the paradise tanager, which is extremely common, and the lemon-throated barbet, and many other insect-eating birds. This is, again, pure bird watching. You find the canopy flock, you listen for the calls, and you look, you just find it and follow the flock until you think you've gotten all the birds. This is one of the few places where we actually can get really good looks at all these birds. Then again, later in midday, we go out and look for army ant swarms. Army ant swarms are a characteristic feature of lowland tropical forests throughout the neotropics. But they have some very, very beautiful birds, these black spotted bear eyes and the hairy crested antbird. And sometimes you even get these ground cuckoos, which are one of the holy grails of tropical birding. This is the rufous-vented ground cuckoo, which follows army ant swarms as well. And that we did not get this on the big day, but this was a pretty good place to see these things. So this was, again, these were very fun places to go birding, because you find an ant swarm, the birds themselves are pretty noisy. You just stand at the leading edge of the ant swarm, the ants come towards you, and all these birds come in, and eventually they get used to you and they show up. And this is, there's only 8 or 10 of them. They're not that hard to get, but it's a highlight of the day. The ants themselves, by the way, are not hard to escape. There's a horror movie in which army ants cause problems, and the only way they can make tension is that all the leading characters have narcolepsy, and they're afraid they're going to fall asleep and to be overrun by army ants. Okay, there are a lot of woodpeckers there, including the wonderfully named red-necked woodpecker, which has a very loud drumming call. If they're there, you know it. This is a relative of the ivory-bill, the imperial woodpecker. The blonde crested woodpecker, no, it's not the blonde crest. That's sorry, Celius flavus. I'm sorry. When you work back in the old days, the English names were very unstable. We only do the Latin names. The collared woodpecker here, and now called the Amazonian collared woodpecker. These woodpeckers are tricky to get, but some of them are quite noisy. But again, this particular bird, there was one pair per probably 500 acres, and you just had to hope you heard them. These things are actually pretty common. These birds have the double tap drumming. You can hear a long way away. But then, then again, that's the more you walk, the more likely you are to run into birds such as these puff birds. This is the white whiskered puff bird, the collared puff bird, and these rare woodpeckers. These are birds that barely make any calls at all. They're inaudible more than 50 feet away. But you just have to walk and walk and walk and hope that you flush them off the ground nests and see these things. And again, this is just one of those things, it's just a matter of time. You won't see all of puffbirds, or 10 or 12 species of puffbirds, but if you, with luck, you'll see a couple of them. There are a large number of hummingbirds, some of which are really quite spectacular, like this Gould's jewel front, some of which are tiny, like this little reddish hermit, other colorful ones, such as the mango here, the black-throated mango. The hummingbirds are also just a matter of kind of luck. You just have to find fruiting and flowering trees and hope you can see them. These birds here have lek breeding systems, so they're relatively easy to find. Now, again, I mentioned that these early successional forests were critical to this particular big day. When this is where the shorebirds would be out on the sandy beaches. The upland sandpipers would be up here in the edge where the grass is longer. But these very early succession, These birds are different from these birds, which are different from these birds, which are again different from these areas here. These river systems are critical. And from a conservation point of view, this is really where it's at. There's one of the reasons why these Peruvian national parks, which are a visionary product of the Peruvian government back in the 70s, they set up these huge national parks to protect not just the jaguars and the caimans and the otters, but also to keep these rivers flowing naturally, to keep creating this diversity, this mosaic of habitats that makes this place such a great place for a big day. Because this patch of forest is only an acre, it's only a couple acres. These are small patches, so you can very quickly move between patches here. And I think that's the reason why the record that we established in this particular day has lasted so long, because other people went to sites where the rivers were bigger, the patches were bigger, and you just simply couldn't cover enough different patches to get the lists. Now, the basic birds you see in these forests mostly are things that are not all that spectacular. I've made it sound like all these tropical birds are absolutely amazing and colorful, but your bread and butter tropical birds are birds such as this elegant wood creeper, which just looks like 4 other species of birds. You can only tell apart by voice. Spine tails, such as this one here, which live in grassy, dense stuff. The striped wood haunter, which is your basic understory bird that uses this bill to poke into suspended dead leaves. There are leaf tossers, which are, again, fortunately noisy. They live on the forest floor and just use their bill to toss leaves to get insects underneath. There aren't too many ant pittas, which are one of the most sought after groups of tropical birds for bird watchers. They tend to be more in the Andes, but there are some birds such as this Amazonian ant pitta. And the tapaculos too. There's only one tapaculo in the lowlands. This one here, the rusty belted tapaculo. But again, it's pretty noisy. These are the birds that you're going to get. And there's just a whole lot of them. And the flycatchers. There are 60 or 70 species of flycatchers. The good old tropical kingbird, which has been invading Florida this year, is super common and very noisy. Couldn't possibly miss it. The bright-rumped Adela, again, a really common flycatcher. There are lots of bicards. We have one bicard that makes it into Arizona. I think Texas too occasionally. There are cotingas, like this beautiful plum-throated cotinga that live up in the tree tops. There are these fruit crows, these large birds that also cotingas that fly between trees. There are mannequins, such as this one here, Professor, what is the English name? Oh my God, I'm forgetting. I'm sorry. Anyway, there are lots of mannequins down there too that have, the males have these very colorful displays, but mostly you just identify them by song. Again, these are the kinds of birds that fill up these big days and make it almost surreally large. And then you get just these pages and pages of antbirds. When this field guide came out to the birds of Colombia, even though it wasn't the same as Peru, we thought we all died and got to heaven because we finally had an accurate field guide with the magnificent plates of Guy Tudor to use to identify groups of birds. A lot of these birds aren't in Peru, but a lot of them are, or there are species that are very similar. And when we got these field guides by Steve Hilty and others, we started really, we really made a lot of progress in these things. One of the saddest coincidences that happened this trip was the day after we did the big day, Ted Parker went out, heard a strange song he'd never heard before, and he recorded it and did a playback and called in this bird here, the Rufous-fronted Antthrush. Prior to that particular day, this bird was known only to a few native peoples who collected them for Frank Chapman, who was one of the early ornithologists. No Westerner had ever seen this bird or knew anything about it before Ted rediscovered this the next day. We almost went back and did the big day again just so we could be the first group ever to have a Rufous-fronted Antthrush on any list, at least the first birders to have it. It's now known to have a fairly large range. It's not all that rare, but it is still, this was the kind of excitement we had facing this. At this particular time, the nests of probably 500 or 600 species of birds in Peru were undescribed. And other species were being discovered. This is the worst slide you will ever see in any talk. You can't see anything else, but this is the list. You can vaguely see, this is the 331 species that we got on that list. This record lasted until I think 2 or 3 years ago. This record lasted 35 years, give or take a few. And we did it all on foot and dugout canoe, 1 square mile. I mean, the people who broke the record moved all up and down the Andes. They moved all over the place. And yet the funny thing about this list is we didn't see anything rare or unusual. We just saw the basic birds there. This was the potential of this place for birding at the time. And now other people now that we have ready access to a lot of the songs, we are really trying to do quite a bit more than this. And I should point out that one of the great experiences of my life recently was when one of my graduate students, Ari Martinez, organized a revisit to the Cochacashu 3 years ago to redo the census that we did many years ago to test to see if the birds were declining the way they have been, they're known to be doing in certain parts of Amazon, Ecuador and Panama and Brazil. And we put together this team, including John Terborgh on the left here, who originally did the census, Rosanna Arcada here, who did the logistics for the whole trip. John Fitzpatrick joined the census this time. I did it, my student did it. We had 4 generations of scientists here working on this particular, and we redid the census. And I'm glad to say that we did not find the birds were declining. Apparently the Montane National Park is big enough to provide at least somewhat of a refuge for these birds. So it doesn't look like climate change has quite made it all the way into this particular area yet. But here we are when we're leaving the place. This was the last time John Terborgh went there. He had been going there for more than 50 continuous years. And he's really, again, that field station has been one of the cores in the history of conservation biology. I should also point out that when I first went to graduate school, again, I'm not proud of this picture. I'm really, I don't want to show it, but my thesis committee consisted of John Terborgh, and this guy here, his name was Robert May, who was a theoretical physicist who decided he wanted to become an ecologist so he could save the whales. And he went on to become one of the most famous scientists in the world. Had he survived, he would have been the global scientist in charge of the COVID epidemic. He was a modeler of infectious diseases. And I hid the fact that I was a bird watcher from my committee because I thought they would view me as frivolously competitive and not motivated by pure science. But when my big year record was annihilated by a guy named Jim Vardaman, who was a great publicity hound, and when he broke my record, it was written up in the Wall Street Journal, which Bob May got. And the Wall Street Journal had mentioned that he broke the record of Scott Robinson, and Bob didn't know about this, and he thought it was a hilarious coincidence that had the same name that I did, one of the graduate students in the department. And when he found that it actually was me, I was dreading that moment. And he actually, from that moment on, he and I were best friends. He loved the fact that I was competitive. He thought I was just this big, oafish, unmotivated bird watcher who just wanted, but when he found that I was competitive, he more or less adopted me, even though I'm practically a mathematical illiterate, certainly by his standards. So this was something, so this kind of balance between birding, listing, and science worked out pretty well. This was a science-based big year, big day. We were able to do this big day partly because we knew where everything was, because we were doing this big census. But we were also very fortunate to have picked a place where you can get around. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Wow, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Love those pictures.
Oh my goodness, amazing.
So there were a few questions. Karen Castle was wondering if all of the birds, now I know some of them did have little names on them, but the ones, were these birds that you photographed?
A lot of these are my photographs, but I have to admit, I borrowed some images from eBird for the last things. I figure I know Fitz well enough that they're not going to sue me for copyright infringement. Yeah, a lot of those photos are mine or my close colleagues with whom I work. We got a lot of first photos for a lot of birds back then.
Nice. Now, Terry wanted to know, was the count all visual sightings or did you include sounds?
So we 99 of the 331 species we only heard. That is in fact, the people the former world record holders who did it in Africa said, well, we had 200, we only had 275, but we saw them all, and that's true, they did. But that's the savannah. It's hard not to see a bird in savannah. The jungle, there's no way. I mean, we were very proud of the fact we saw more than 200 of those species. That we thought that was pretty impressive. But of course, some purists say, oh, we got to see them, and that's not how I do big days. But that's definitely a matter of personal taste.
Now, Juanita wanted to know, how many birds did you have again? I think you said it once, but how many were on the first trip and then how many on the second trip?
Well, the 331 bird species was the one big day we did. I've tried to break that record 10 times subsequently and never, I got to 326, but it was the Ted Parker, that last 6 or 7 species was the Ted Parker effect. He is simply an unbelievable bird. Ted could pick out any bird song anywhere. You could play a song of a bird from Thailand when he's sitting in the Amazon basin, and he would hear the song and say, that's a so-and-so warbler from Thailand. He didn't need the context. I need to know where I am. I need to connect to access my memory of bird songs. He didn't have to do it. He just had a flawless memory. And of course, he was a great birder too. So yes, but I actually went, I visited Coachacashu for 13 consecutive years. I did a postdoc there, and I had some graduate students working there as well. So it was very dangerous to work in Peru for about a 10-year period when the Sendero Luminoso, the organization, was trying to rage a guerrilla war against.
Now, Kathy wanted to know, where do you enjoy birding now?
Well, I'm a big yard birder now. I kind of bird wherever my students are doing research. That's where I go bird watching now, which not coincidentally is sometimes in really cool places that I've never been before. But I do a lot of backyard birding in northern Marion County, just south of Tuscaloosa Prairie, if you know anything about that area. I like doing yard listing and county listing to a lesser extent, and then but my world list is my main passion.
How many do you have on your world list?
About 7,100. And that's not that the big time listers have 9,000 or more now. I'm not even competitive with the really big timers. But
how big is your yard list? How many birds?
I got 217, but we've only lived there 4 years since we moved out of the country. So that's a good list, but it's a big yard. It's a 23-acre yard, so it's not a yard. It should be a patch. I know. I cheat. I'm sorry. But all the other top lists are also often involve 5-mile walks from the backyard. So I figure I'm not quite that far out there. At least it's all my own land. So.
Now, Juanita wanted to know, okay, you had a special turn in the river with habitats. Are there more turns in habitats that would be similar? Or did you know you had the best site?
Oh, yeah, there were probably oxbow lakes that are just as good. Coachacashu was really nice because for whatever reason, the forest was very old there. And the river meanders back and forth across the floodplain pretty rapidly, and most forest is young. But there's a peculiarity of that river there, that the forest there may be probably at least 500 or 600 years old. So it's a really old forest. And so you get a lot of these old growth forest birds, but you still get all the river edge birds and the lake edge birds. And if we had a trail system going up into terra firma, we could have crossed the river and added probably 40 more species. In fact, I maintain that a carefully planned big day down there could get 400, and it's still not doing anything, not using any internal combustion engine to go anywhere. I mean, it hasn't been done yet, but it could happen. Oh, and bamboo, there's lots of birds that are bamboo specialists. Andy Cratter, who's the curator or the collection manager of birds here at the Florida Museum, studied bamboo birds. And he worked in a pretty similar area. And so yeah, so I think the record is easily breakable. So
Okay, so if somebody out there wants to work on that, you can give them some advice, right?
oh yeah, yes. I'm planning on working for a bit longer now. I still feel like I have things to contribute. So I still have students who are joining my lab, although eventually I'll have to stop the student training or get co-advisors for everybody. So here's a question. There current political unrest in Peru. We're going today to Peru. I'm not, Peru is a little rough, but not too bad. Peru's always kind of, the society in Peru has had a lot of unrest continuously. I don't think there's any big time terrorism right now, is there? If it is, it's very recent. Peru is pretty safe. I mean, I've got 2 students working there right now, right now. You can work in northeastern Peru in the Amazonic sections of Loreto, around the city of Iquitos, which is fantastic birding, very safe. Mandu Road is very, very safe. Cusco is still very safe. It's a tourist-based economy. It's an amazing city, amazing people there. But again, there's a lot of corruption and there's a lot of the politics in Peru are a little ugly. That's one of the reasons why the terrorists, the Sendero Luminoso, were so effective, was because they were fighting what was undoubtedly a corrupt government. I don't think the precautions you need to take now are anything more than just staying in the well-established tourist sites. And I think you can go into even very remote sites right now at very little risk. You got to understand, once you get into the really remote Andes or the really remote Amazon basin, there's no politics at all. Those people, they know they live in Peru in a vague sort of way, but there really isn't much. They're not really that connected to Peruvians. Nearly all of them live up in the mountains or on the coast.
Now I have kind of an unrelated question. How bad were the mosquitoes?
Well, it's a wet season, they're pretty bad. Dry season, you wear repellent. I mean, if you wear repellent, you're fine. You notice we all wear long sleeve shirts and long pants, and except on boat trips like this, and you sweat a whole lot. I mean, it's just really, it's kind of like a permanent August in Gainesville kind of climate. But in fact, the humidity is almost always 100%, except in midday. I don't mind that climate. I've always done pretty well in it. But it's, and then these cold fronts that come through or give you a little New England in September kind of weather now and then, which is really fun. You can run or walk and hike all over the place and not sweat. That's a glorious thing. There are snakes there, but no one's ever been. Swimming in the lake with caimans is probably the most dangerous thing. Actually, the most dangerous thing by far is falling trees, because you're this massive canopy, and during storms you can easily get caught under a tree. That again never happened in Coachicashu.
Very good. All right, and we had a lot of people saying great presentation, so that was
Thank you.
good. Any more questions? All right.
Okay.
Well, thank